Marcus Chen stared at his computer screen in disbelief. The message from his supervisor at the Terran Diplomatic Corps had arrived just 5 minutes ago. But he had already read it 3 times. Each time, the words stayed the same, even though they made no sense. He was being sent to Zephyria. Not as backup support or technical assistance, but as the primary translator for trade negotiations. Marcus had been working as a mid-level translator for 8 years, mostly handling routine communications between Earth and the smaller trading colonies. He had never worked on anything this important before. The Zephyrian Empire controlled some of the most advanced technology in the galaxy. Their quantum crystalline systems could process information faster than anything humans had ever built. A trade agreement with them could change everything for humanity. And somehow, they wanted him to handle the translations. Marcus picked up his coffee mug and realized his hand was shaking slightly. This had to be some kind of mistake. The Zephyrians were known throughout the galaxy for their incredible language skills. Most of them could speak dozens of alien languages perfectly. Their society valued perfect speech above almost everything else. Why would they need a human translator? Everyone knew that humans were considered the worst speakers in the galaxy. Human languages were full of exceptions, unclear rules, and emotional sounds that most aliens found confusing or annoying. Other species had evolved clean, logical languages with clear patterns. Humans had created a mess of different tongues that changed constantly. His computer chimed with another message. This one was from Director Walsh, his direct supervisor. Chen, I know you're confused about this assignment. Trust me, so am I. The Zephyrians specifically requested a human translator. They wouldn't tell us why. The negotiations start in 3 days. Your transport leaves in 6 hours. Don't mess this up. The future of human technology depends on these talks. Marcus leaned back in his chair. 6 hours to prepare for the most important job of his life. He had studied Zephyrian language patterns before, but only the basic forms that most diplomats used. If he was going to be the primary translator, he needed to understand their complex social structures and formal speech patterns. He spent the next 4 hours cramming everything he could find about Zephyrian culture into his brain. The more he learned, the more worried he became. Zephyrians lived by something called crystalline speech. Every word had to be perfectly pronounced and properly placed. Speaking incorrectly was not just embarrassing. It was considered a sign of inferior intelligence and poor breeding. Their society was divided into strict levels based partly on how well someone could speak. The royal family was at the top because they had mastered the most languages with perfect pronunciation. Making mistakes in front of them could end diplomatic relationships permanently. The transport ship to Zephyria was a sleek Zephyrian vessel that moved through space almost silently. Marcus spent the 3-day journey studying language files and practicing pronunciation exercises. The other human diplomats on board mostly ignored him. He could tell they thought he was going to fail. Ambassador Rodriguez, the head of the human delegation, finally spoke to him on the last day of travel. Chen, I'll be honest with you. None of us understand why you're here. We have senior translators with 20 years of experience who would have been better choices for this mission. But for some reason, the Zephyrians asked for you specifically. Marcus looked up from his study materials. They asked for me? I thought they just requested any human translator. No, they sent your name. Marcus Chen from the Terran Diplomatic Corps. We have no idea how they even knew you existed. Your file says you've never had any contact with Zephyrian officials before. This news made Marcus even more nervous. How could aliens he had never met know his name? And why would they want him instead of someone more qualified? When their ship finally reached Zephyria, Marcus got his first look at the crystal world through the transport windows. The entire planet seemed to glow with soft blue and purple light. The cities were built from some kind of living crystal that grew in beautiful, complex patterns. It was the most amazing thing he had ever seen. The landing bay where they arrived was enormous, with crystal walls that rose hundreds of feet above them. As their group walked across the smooth floor, their footsteps created soft musical sounds. Everything on this world seemed to be designed to make beautiful noise. A group of Zephyrians waited for them at the entrance to the main building. They were tall and thin, with skin that looked like polished stone. Patterns of light moved slowly across their faces and hands. Marcus had seen pictures of Zephyrians before, but meeting them in person was completely different. They moved with perfect grace, and when they spoke, their voices created harmonious sounds that were almost like singing. The lead Zephyrian stepped forward and spoke in perfect English. "Welcome to Zephyria, honored guests. I am Minister Thale. We are pleased that you have accepted our invitation to these important discussions." Ambassador Rodriguez responded with the formal greeting that human diplomats always used, but when he spoke, his words sounded rough and clumsy compared to the beautiful speech of the Zephyrians. Marcus could see the aliens trying not to show their reaction to the harsh human sounds. Minister Thale continued. "Tomorrow, we will begin our negotiations in the Grand Resonance Chamber. Princess Lirelei, heir to our throne, will represent our interests. We trust that Translator Chen is prepared for his duties." All eyes turned to Marcus. He felt his face getting red as he bowed slightly. "Yes, Minister, I'm ready to serve." "Excellent. Please understand that these discussions will determine the future relationship between our peoples. The princess has mastered over 200 galactic languages and has never required translation assistance before. She speaks your language better than most humans. Your presence here represents something unusual." The way Minister Thale said the word unusual made Marcus's stomach turn. He was being set up to fail in front of the most important people in the galaxy. Whatever game the Zephyrians were playing, he was apparently the main piece. As they were led to their guest quarters through corridors filled with singing crystal, Marcus wondered if he would still have a job when this was all over. Marcus barely slept that night. His guest room was beautiful, with walls made of soft, glowing crystal that changed colors slowly throughout the evening. But every time he started to relax, he thought about the next day and his stomach would tie itself in knots. He had spent hours reviewing his notes about Zephyrian formal speech patterns. The language had 17 different levels of politeness, and using the wrong level could accidentally insult someone. Worse, the Zephyrians could hear tiny differences in pronunciation that humans usually missed completely. When morning came, Minister Thale arrived to escort the human delegation to the Grand Resonance Chamber. The walk through the Crystal Palace took nearly 20 minutes. Every hallway was filled with amazing artwork and beautiful sounds. Marcus tried to focus on his upcoming duties, but the palace was so incredible that he kept getting distracted. The Grand Resonance Chamber was built 800 years ago, Minister Thale explained as they walked. It was designed so that every word spoken inside creates musical vibrations through the crystal walls. Perfect speech creates beautiful harmony. Imperfect speech creates discord that can be quite painful for our people to hear. Ambassador Rodriguez looked worried. "Painful? You mean physically painful?" "Yes, honored guest. Our hearing is much more sensitive than yours. When words are spoken incorrectly in the chamber, the crystal walls amplify the linguistic errors into sounds that hurt our ears. This is why we always require speakers to demonstrate proper language skills before entering." Marcus felt like throwing up. Not only did he have to translate perfectly, but if he made mistakes, he would literally cause pain to everyone in the room. No pressure at all. The Grand Resonance Chamber was the most beautiful room Marcus had ever seen. The ceiling rose high above them in a dome shape, covered with crystals of every color. Hundreds of Zephyrians sat in curved rows around the central speaking area. When they walked into the room, the crystals began to glow more brightly, responding to their presence. At the front of the chamber, on a raised platform made of pure white crystal, sat Princess Lirelei. Marcus had to force himself not to stare. The princess was tall even for a Zephyrian, with silver-blue skin that seemed to glow from within. Patterns of light moved across her face and arms in complex designs that Marcus had never seen before. Her eyes were large and completely silver, like mirrors that reflected the crystal light around them. When she spoke, her voice was the most perfect sound Marcus had ever heard. It was like listening to music and poetry at the same time. "Welcome, friends from Earth," Princess Lirelei said, but she wasn't speaking English. She was speaking in what sounded like perfect Zephyrian, then switching smoothly to Altarian trade language, then to formal Centauri diplomatic speech. Each language flowed from her lips without any accent or hesitation. "We are honored to receive you in our sacred chamber. Marcus realized she was showing off. She wanted everyone to see how perfectly she could speak multiple languages before the real negotiations began. It was an intimidating display, and it was working. The human delegation looked impressed and worried at the same time. Ambassador Rodriguez responded with the formal opening statement that human diplomats always used for trade negotiations. His words sounded clumsy and rough after the princess's perfect speech. Marcus could see several Zephyrians in the audience wince slightly when he spoke. Princess Lirelei responded immediately. But instead of using the simple diplomatic language that Marcus expected, she began speaking in an extremely complex form of Zephyrian that included legal terms, historical references, and cultural concepts that most translators would struggle with. Marcus's translation device began working frantically, trying to process her words. But the software kept hitting phrases it couldn't understand completely. He found himself guessing at meanings and hoping he was close to correct. "The princess says that she welcomes our discussion about trade possibilities," Marcus announced. "She mentions that Zephyrian law requires careful consideration of all cultural impacts before agreements can be made." Princess Lirelei turned those silver eyes toward Marcus. When she spoke again, her words were even more complex. She was using verb forms that Marcus had only read about in advanced language studies. Her sentences included references to Zephyrian history that he didn't recognize. As Marcus struggled to keep up with her speech, he began to notice something strange. Some of the terms she was using didn't quite match what his translation software expected. When she talked about trade routes, she used a word that actually meant paths of dependency. When she mentioned resource sharing, she used a phrase that implied taking from the resource sharing, trade routes, weak. At first, Marcus thought he was making translation errors. But as the conversation continued, he became more sure that Princess Lirelei was deliberately choosing words that had double meanings. She was saying one thing to the Zephyrian audience and letting his translations say something different to the humans. She was making him look incompetent on purpose. The princess continued her linguistic display, switching between several different Zephyrian dialects and occasionally throwing in phrases from other alien languages. Each time she spoke, Marcus had to work harder to understand her meaning. His translation device was overheating from the effort. "The princess is explaining their concerns about environmental impact," Marcus announced, wiping sweat from his forehead. "She wants to ensure that any agreement protects Zephyrian interests." But what Princess Lirelei had actually said was much more specific. She had listed exact concerns about human industrial methods and questioned whether Earth's people could be trusted to follow any agreement they signed. Her words were polite but filled with implied insults about human reliability. Marcus could see that Ambassador Rodriguez was getting frustrated. The negotiations were moving very slowly because of all the complex translation work. The other human diplomats kept looking at their notes and frowning. They could tell something was wrong, but they couldn't figure out what. As the morning session continued, Princess Lirelei kept making her language more and more complicated. She began using ancient Zephyrian phrases that Marcus had never encountered before. His translation software started giving him error messages. During a break in the formal discussions, Marcus checked his equipment. Everything was working correctly. The problem wasn't with his tools. The princess was deliberately speaking in ways that would be nearly impossible for any human to translate accurately. She was testing him. And so far, he was failing. By the afternoon session, Marcus felt like his brain was melting. Princess Lirelei had spent the entire morning making the negotiations as difficult as possible. Every time he thought he understood what she was saying, she would switch to an even more complex form of speech. The worst part was that he was sure she was doing it on purpose. When she spoke to her own advisors, she used simple, clear Zephyrian that Marcus could follow easily. But when she addressed the human delegation, she became almost impossible to understand. Ambassador Rodriguez was getting angry. Marcus could see it in the way he kept clenching his hands and checking his watch. The other human diplomats were whispering among themselves, clearly unhappy with how slowly things were moving. "Perhaps we could discuss specific trade volumes," Ambassador Rodriguez suggested during a brief pause. "We're interested in acquiring Zephyrian quantum crystalline processors in exchange for rare earth materials from our outer colonies." Princess Lirelei smiled when she heard this. It wasn't a friendly smile. Marcus had a bad feeling about what was coming next. When she responded, her words were like a puzzle wrapped in riddles. She talked about crystalline harmonies, and resource symphonies, and the mathematics of mutual benefit. Every sentence included at least 3 concepts that could mean completely different things, depending on context. Marcus's translation device started throwing up warning messages. The software was designed to handle complex alien languages. But Princess Lirale was pushing it beyond its limits. He found himself guessing at meanings and hoping he wasn't making terrible mistakes. The princess says that Zephyrian technology requires careful consideration, Marcus announced, feeling sweat drip down his back. She mentions that quantum crystalline systems need specific environmental conditions to function properly. Ambassador Rodriguez frowned. What kind of environmental conditions? We need specific details if we're going to make this work. When Marcus asked for clarification, Princess Lirale launched into an explanation that was even more confusing than her previous statements. She used technical terms that didn't exist in any human language, combined with cultural references that made no sense, wrapped up in grammar so complex that Marcus wasn't even sure what she was talking about. As he struggled to translate her words, Marcus began to realize what was really happening. Princess Lirale wasn't just testing his language skills. She was trying to make the negotiations fail completely. She was using her perfect command of language as a weapon to drive the humans away. But why? The Zephyrians had invited them here. They had specifically requested Marcus as their translator. What was the point of sabotaging their own trade talks? The session continued for another hour. Princess Lirale kept making her speech more and more impossible to follow. Marcus's translation device finally gave up completely and shut down from overheating. He was left trying to translate ancient Zephyrian legal phrases using nothing but his basic language training and increasingly desperate guesswork. The human delegation was clearly losing patience. Ambassador Rodriguez kept checking his watch and frowning. The other diplomats were passing notes back and forth, probably discussing whether to end the negotiations and go home. Finally, Princess Lirale stood up from her crystal throne. When she spoke this time, her voice was different, colder, more formal. Marcus could tell she was preparing to deliver some kind of final statement. The words that came out of her mouth were in a form of Zephyrian that Marcus had never heard before. It was ancient and formal, with sounds that seemed to echo strangely in the crystal chamber. Even without understanding exactly what she was saying, Marcus could tell it was an insult of some kind. Her tone made that clear. His translation software was completely dead, so he had to rely on his own knowledge. The phrase she had used included several words that he recognized from his studies of historical Zephyrian texts. Something about worthless, and sound makers, and pollution. She was calling the humans worthless sound makers who polluted civilized discussion. Marcus felt something snap inside him. He had spent 3 days preparing for this assignment. He had worked harder than he had ever worked before, trying to do a good job for his people, and this alien princess was sabotaging everything just to prove that humans weren't good enough to talk to her. Well, Marcus said, too tired and frustrated to think carefully about his words. Your crystalline perfection sure makes it hard to hear the music. The moment the words left his mouth, Marcus knew something was wrong. He had been trying to speak in Zephyrian, but his pronunciation was terrible because he was exhausted and angry. The sounds that came out were rough and emotional. Nothing like the perfect speech that Zephyrians valued. But something strange happened when his badly pronounced words hit the crystal walls of the chamber. Instead of creating the harsh discord that imperfect speech usually made, the crystals began to sing, not just any song, but a complex harmony that seemed to make the entire room glow more brightly. Every Zephyrian in the chamber stopped moving. They stared at Marcus with expressions he couldn't read. Princess Lirale stood frozen on her platform, her silver eyes wide with shock. The singing from the crystal walls continued for several more seconds before slowly fading away. When silence returned to the chamber, nobody moved or spoke. The air felt heavy with some kind of importance that Marcus didn't understand. Finally, Princess Lirale found her voice. When she spoke, her words were shaky and uncertain for the first time since Marcus had met her. What did you just say? she asked. She was speaking in perfect English now, not the complex Zephyrian she had been using all day. Marcus felt confused and embarrassed. I'm sorry, Your Highness. I was trying to say something in your language, but I know my pronunciation is terrible. I didn't mean to offend anyone. No, Princess Lorelei said, stepping down from her platform. Say it again. Exactly the same way you said it before. Marcus looked around the chamber. Every single Zephyrian was staring at him with intense focus. Even the air felt different, charged with expectation. I don't remember exactly what I said, Marcus admitted. I was frustrated and tired, and I just responded without thinking. It was probably nonsense. But Princess Lorelei was already moving toward him, her eyes bright with something that looked like hope mixed with disbelief. Whatever had just happened, Marcus knew that nothing would be the same after this moment. Princess Lorelei reached Marcus and stopped just a few feet away from him. Up close, he could see that her hands were shaking. The light patterns moving across her skin were changing rapidly, flashing through colors that he had never seen on any Zephyrian before. Please, she said, her perfect voice now rough with emotion. You must try to remember what you said. The exact words. The exact sounds. This is more important than you can possibly understand. Marcus looked around the chamber again. Every Zephyrian was leaning forward in their seats, watching him with desperate intensity. Ambassador Rodriguez and the other humans looked completely confused. They had no idea what was happening. I really don't remember the exact words, Marcus said honestly. I was angry and tired, and I just spoke without thinking. It was something about your perfect speech making it hard to hear music, but I know I said it wrong because my Zephyrian pronunciation is terrible. Princess Lorelei closed her silver eyes for a moment. When she opened them again, Marcus could see what looked like tears. Your pronunciation wasn't terrible, she whispered. It was perfect. Perfectly imperfect. In exactly the right way. She turned to address the chamber, speaking in rapid Zephyrian to her people. Marcus caught a few words here and there, but she was speaking too quickly and emotionally for him to follow. Whatever she was saying was causing a stir among the audience. Some Zephyrians were standing up, others were making excited sounds that the crystal walls amplified into complex harmonies. Finally, Princess Lorelei turned back to Marcus. She took a deep breath and began to explain. For over 3,000 years, my people have been trying to understand the language of our ancestors, she said. We call them the ethereal builders because of the incredible structures they created using sound and crystal technology. They built cities that sang, machines that responded to emotional speech, art that could only be activated by specific types of pronunciation. Marcus nodded, not sure where this was going but sensing that it was important. When the ethereal civilization ended, they left behind thousands of ruins with writing that we could read but couldn't speak. We knew what their words meant, but we couldn't make them work. Every time we tried to pronounce their phrases, nothing happened. We thought the technology was broken, or that we had lost some crucial knowledge. Princess Lorelei gestured toward the crystal walls around them. This chamber was built to help us study ethereal speech patterns. We've had thousands of our best linguists try to speak their words correctly. Nothing ever worked. But what does this have to do with what I said? Marcus asked. The phrase you spoke, Princess Lorelei said, her voice filled with wonder, was perfect ancient ethereal. Through imperfection, harmony finds its true voice. It's one of the central teachings from their philosophical texts. We've known what it meant for centuries, but no one has ever been able to make the crystal respond to it before now. Marcus felt like his brain was struggling to catch up. But I don't know any ancient ethereal. I've never even heard of it before today. That's exactly why it worked, Princess Lorelei explained. We've spent so long trying to speak their language with perfect Zephyrian pronunciation, but the ethereal builders didn't value perfection the way we do. They believed that emotion and imperfection were essential parts of communication. Your human accent, your emotional pronunciation, your terrible speech patterns. That's exactly what their language needed. She gestured toward the other Zephyrians in the chamber. My people have spent millennia pursuing perfect speech. We believe that flawless pronunciation and proper grammar show intelligence and worthiness, but the ethereals believed the opposite. They thought that perfect speech was empty speech, that real communication required emotion and personal expression. Marcus was beginning to understand, but it still seemed impossible. So, you're saying that humans speak more like your ancient ancestors than you do? Exactly, Princess Lirelei said. Human languages are chaotic and emotional. They change constantly. They're full of exceptions and regional differences and personal quirks. That's exactly what ethereal language was like. Every person spoke slightly differently, and that difference was considered beautiful. Ambassador Rodriguez stepped forward, clearly confused. Your Highness, I don't understand what's happening here. Are we still discussing trade negotiations? Princess Lirelei turned toward him, and Marcus could see a completely different person than the cold, testing ruler from that morning. Her eyes were bright with excitement and something that looked like relief. Ambassador Rodriguez, your translator has just solved a mystery that my people have been working on for 3,000 years. He's shown us that everything we thought we knew about communication was wrong. She turned back to Marcus. For generations, my family has searched for someone who could speak ancient ethereal. We've tested linguists from every species in the galaxy. When we heard that humans had joined the galactic community, we wondered if your chaotic languages might be the key. That's why we requested you specifically. But how did you know about me? Marcus asked. We've been monitoring human communications for months, looking for speech patterns that resembled ethereal characteristics. Your translation work showed exactly the kind of emotional, imperfect pronunciation that we thought might work. So we requested you for these negotiations. Marcus realized what this meant. The trade negotiations were never the real purpose, were they? You were testing me to see if I could speak ancient ethereal. Princess Lirelei nodded. I apologize for deceiving you. I made the discussions as difficult as possible to create frustration and emotional stress. Ancient ethereal could only be spoken with genuine feeling. I needed to push you until you responded naturally, without trying to be perfect. She paused, looking around the crystal chamber that was still glowing more brightly than before. What you've given us today is worth more than any trade agreement. You've reconnected us with our true heritage and shown us that our pursuit of perfection has actually made us lose our ability to really communicate. Marcus felt overwhelmed. He had come here thinking he was just a backup translator for a routine negotiation. Instead, he had accidentally become part of an alien species' spiritual awakening. What happens now? He asked. Princess Lirelei smiled, and for the first time since he had met her, it looked completely genuine. Now, Marcus Chen of Earth, I would be honored if you would teach my people how to speak with beautiful imperfection. 3 months later, Marcus stood in what used to be called the Grand Resonance Chamber. But it didn't look the same anymore. The perfect crystal walls now pulsed with dozens of different colors, responding to the voices of beings from across the galaxy who had come to study at the New Harmony Institute. Princess Lirelei approached him. But she was different too. Her speech had changed completely, from the perfect, cold pronunciation she had used when they first met. Now when she spoke, her words carried emotion and personal quirks that made them uniquely hers. Good morning, Marcus, she said, deliberately using the slightly rough accent that she had developed. Are you ready for today's session? Marcus smiled. As ready as anyone can be to teach aliens how to speak badly. The princess laughed. 3 months ago, no Zephyrian would have made such an uncontrolled sound in the sacred chamber. Now the crystal walls caught her laughter and turned it into a complex musical harmony that filled the room with joy. The transformation had been amazing to watch. Once Princess Lirelei announced what had happened, Zephyrians throughout the Empire began experimenting with more emotional speech. At first, it was difficult for them. They had spent their entire lives trying to speak perfectly, and deliberately adding imperfections felt wrong. But as more Zephyrians learned to express themselves with emotional pronunciation and personal style, something wonderful had happened. They began to really connect with each other for the first time in centuries. Perfect speech had kept them isolated in individual bubbles of correctness. Imperfect speech let them share real feelings and thoughts. The changes went beyond just language. Zephyrian art, which had been formal and identical for generations, suddenly exploded with creativity and personal expression. Their technology advanced rapidly as engineers began communicating more freely about their ideas. Even their government became more flexible, as officials learned to express disagreement and debate without worrying about perfect protocols. But the biggest change was in how the Zephyrians related to other species. For the first time, they began to appreciate the different ways that various aliens communicated. Instead of seeing alien accents and linguistic quirks as flaws, they started recognizing them as valuable forms of expression. The Harmony Institute had been Princess Lirelei's idea. She wanted to create a place where beings from different worlds could come together to learn about communication diversity. Representatives from dozens of species now studied there, sharing their unique linguistic traditions and learning from each other. Marcus had become the Institute's first director of human communication studies. His job was to help other species understand how human emotional expression worked and why it was valuable. He also worked with humans to help them appreciate the benefits of other species' communication styles. Today's session was special because they were hosting a group of young Zephyrians who had never learned the old perfect speech patterns. These children had grown up speaking with emotion and personal style, and Marcus wanted to show them how their new way of talking connected to the ancient ethereal traditions. Before we begin, Princess Lirelei announced to the group, "I want everyone to remember that there are no perfect sentences today. Express yourselves, however, feels natural." The young Zephyrians laughed and began talking excitedly among themselves. Their voices created a beautiful chaos of overlapping sounds that the crystal walls transformed into complex musical patterns. Each child's speech had its own personality and emotional tone. Marcus watched them and felt proud of how far they had all come. The trade negotiations that had brought him to Zephyria had eventually been completed, but they had been much more successful than anyone expected. Once the Zephyrians learned to communicate more openly, they discovered that they genuinely enjoyed working with humans and other species. The quantum crystalline technology that Earth had wanted was now shared freely, along with much more advanced systems that the Zephyrians had developed using their new collaborative communication methods. In return, humans had shared their own technological innovations and cultural traditions, but more important than any technology trade was the new understanding that had spread throughout the galaxy about the value of communication diversity. Species that had looked down on each other for linguistic differences now celebrated those differences as sources of creativity and innovation. "Marcus," one of the young Zephyrians called out, "can you tell us again about the day you accidentally spoke ancient ethereal?" Marcus grinned. He had told this story hundreds of times, but it never got old. "Well, I was frustrated and tired, and I just said what I was feeling without thinking about pronunciation rules." As he began the familiar tale, Marcus reflected on how much his life had changed. He had come to Zephyria as a nervous translator worried about failing at his job. Now, he was part of a galactic movement that was changing how entire civilizations thought about communication. The most amazing part was that it had all started with what he thought was a mistake. His terrible pronunciation and emotional speech patterns had turned out to be exactly what the galaxy needed to rediscover the value of authentic communication. Ambassador Rodriguez visited regularly now, leading trade delegations that worked much more smoothly than the old formal negotiations. During his last visit, he had pulled Marcus aside with a confession. "You know, Chen, when I first saw you struggling with those translations, I thought you were going to ruin everything for us. I had no idea that your struggles were actually the point. Your human way of communicating was the key to all of this." Princess Lirelei had also changed in ways that went beyond language. As she learned to express herself more emotionally, she had become a more effective leader. Her people trusted her more because they could hear genuine feeling in her voice when she spoke to them. The session ended with all the young Zephyrians trying to recreate Marcus's original slip of the tongue. Each one pronounced the ancient ethereal phrase slightly differently, adding their own emotional interpretation. The crystal walls sang with dozens of different harmonies, creating music that would have been impossible under the old system of perfect speech. As the children left the chamber, still chattering excitedly in their individual voices, Princess Lirelei and Marcus stood together, watching the crystal walls continue to pulse with color. Do you think the ethereal builders would be proud of what we've accomplished? The princess asked. Marcus listened to the fading echoes of diverse voices creating harmony together. I think they'd be amazed at how far their ideas have spread, and I think they'd love that it all started with a human who couldn't pronounce their language correctly. Princess Lirelei laughed, and the crystal walls caught her laughter and transformed it into music that seemed to celebrate not just their success, but the beautiful imperfection of all communication throughout the galaxy.